Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks again for joining us. I'm Oriana Senatore with the Institute for Legal Reform, and I'm excited to host today's first panel. First, I want to echo Harold's point that we're really on the cusp of the unknown when we think about the future of litigation. But whatever happens, it's clear that lawyers are the only ones who really benefit from more lawsuits, and it's everyone else who bears the burden. That means customers who pay more at the cash register, workers who can't get the hours they need, and job seekers with fewer paths to put food on the table. And if you happen to own a small business, lawsuits can mean the difference between staying afloat and going under. This year, ILR and the Brattle Group conducted an empirical study to find out exactly how much of a burden the commercial tort system places on small businesses in particular. And unfortunately, the results are pretty grim. Using the most current data available, we found that in 2018, small businesses earning less than $10 million in revenue faced almost $182 billion in commercial tort liability costs. That's a huge burden to place on people who actually create a majority of the jobs in the United States. And it's completely unsustainable, especially when they're trying to recover from a pandemic. Thankfully, we have two guests this afternoon who are well positioned to shed some light on this trend. On the academic side, we're lucky to have David McKnight from the Brattle Group, where he serves as an economic consultant with an extensive background in litigation, arbitration, and regulatory matters. And of course, he also co-authored the study that we're talking about today, so you could say that he actually wrote the book on the issue we're talking about. Also joining us is Chuck Jones, an authority on all things caffeine and a successful small business owner in Pasadena, California. Chuck's company, Jones Coffee Roasters, has been going strong for 25 years. But Chuck spent most of the last decade fighting a lawsuit that could have forced him to put cancer warnings on his coffee under California's Prop 65 law. A judge finally threw out that lawsuit last year, but Chuck spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in the process. Chuck, I'm sorry to put it this way, but you might be the poster boy for abusive and frivolous litigation, but we really appreciate you joining us today. So first, David, I'd like to start the conversation with you. A moment ago, I mentioned what I think of as the headline of this study, that small businesses are shouldering over $180 billion in tort costs. That is a huge number. So can you give it a little more context?
Sure. Thank you, Oriana. So this latest study, it actually builds on some of our prior work in estimating the costs of the U.S. tort system and the volume of the awards that are paid, focusing in particular on liability costs for businesses. In this study, we use detailed data on commercial liability insurance placements in the United States, as well as estimates of the number of firms that are uninsured to compute the costs and compensation paid in the U.S. tort system. The study uses a novel data set developed by ISO Market Stance that develops a very granular view of the market for liability insurance in the U.S. They combine data on businesses in the United States with information on rate filing and actual placements of liability insurance to compute the total amount of insurable risk in the United States across companies of different sizes, across industries, and across geographies. Using these data, we can actually see how liability costs have changed over time and how these costs are distributed across businesses. What we found in this study, that in 2016, which is the date of our last study on the size of the U.S. tort system, 2018, which is the most recent year of data we had available for this study, the commercial tort liability in the United States grew 14%. It grew from $300 billion in 2016 to $343 billion in 2018. That's growth of almost 7% a year over that time frame. Drilling a little deeper into these estimates, we find that only about half of this growth in liability costs can be explained by the overall growth in the economy over that same period. This means that about 7% of the growth in commercial and tort liability costs is attributable to the higher prices of commercial tort liability. You can think of price of commercial tort liability to be the tort costs that a firm will incur for a given amount of economic activity. In this study, we defined the price to be the amount of commercial liability a firm is expected to incur for each $1,000 revenue it generates. What we found is that in 2018, the price of commercial tort liability in the United States was $8.26. That is, for every $1,000 in revenue a business earns, it can be expected to generate $8.26 of tort liability. While the price of tort liability grew 7% between 2016 and 2018, this increase did not fall onto all companies evenly. What we found is that the price of commercial tort liability grew much faster for small businesses than it did for large businesses. In fact, nearly all of the growth in the price of commercial tort liability fell on companies that have less than $10 million in annual sales. In part, as a result of this disparity, we find that small businesses are bearing a disproportionate share of the cost of the tort system. So what this study finds is that between 2016 and 2018, commercial liability costs grew from $300 billion to $343 billion, and that more of half of this growth is actually the result of higher prices for small businesses.
Great, thanks, David. That really helps shed some light and explain how you came to this unfortunate but maybe not so surprising findings. So that's a little bit of context from the economic perspective. But Chuck, you've been up close and personal with this issue in real life, and I'd like to get your take. You had the unfortunate experience of a California Prop 65 lawsuit that sounds extremely frustrating. So I'm sorry to ask you to relive it, but could you walk us through what happened and where things stand now?
Yeah, thank you very much for bringing this up, because it's been crazy for me and my family and our business. When we first were stirred with this complaint by Mr. Metzger. Mr. Metzger told us that we were violating some rules as part of the Prop 65 Clean Water Act, and I think that was from the mid-'80s, and we didn't really know anything about it, but apparently I didn't really think that much about it and didn't really do that much about it until we were served with the complaint, and it told us that we were violating and basically poisoning the public. So we had to go through this process of discovery where we were required to give up 10 years worth of our financials. And then we had to break down in those financials how much coffee we were roasting on a daily basis, which how many cups did that translate to, which meant that eventually he was able to determine that we were poisoning the general public. So I guess some part of the proposition allowed for Mr. Metzger to represent the citizens of the state as a nonprofit. So he created a nonprofit called CERT. It's an acronym for Citizens for the Education, blah, blah, blah. I'm not quite sure what it means. It doesn't mean anything positive to me, but he created a nonprofit. He represented this nonprofit, and he went to a Whole Foods supermarket, and off the shelf, he collected a group of roasters that were serving coffee in the state of California. And eventually our group was about 200 roasters, and we created a joint defense group with Morrison Forster that fought this case for us for about 7 years. And in that time, I spent about $150,000 trying to defend our case. I was the smallest defendant in the whole joint defense group. And there was a couple of times where we thought about settling with Mr. Metzger. And at one point, Mr. Metzger used this as a case example. Well, the first time we tried to settle, he said that he wanted 10 years of net profits in order to settle, which would have been, would have pretty much closed us down. And then at one point, he actually used our company, since we were the smallest defendant in the joint defense group. The largest was Starbucks and Green Mountain Coffee Roasters and Keurig. He told the group that Jones Coffee Roasters had violated the Proposition 65 for $1 trillion. And I'm not sure that that's very sustainable, but that was what the case was. And it's not completely closed yet, because there's a few more motions that are having to be dealt with, but there's definitely no more wind left in the sails, because the National Institute of Health and the National Cancer Institute finally determined after 7 years that it took them that long to figure out that coffee was not harmful to people's health, and that coffee or acrylamide, which is a byproduct of the roasting process, a natural byproduct of the roasting process, was not considered a carcinogen.
Well, Chuck, that is quite a story. And just quickly to follow up on all that, obviously the lawsuit was a huge burden from a pure dollars and cents perspective. But what else did it mean for you in terms of the choices that you had to make as a business owner?
you know, we weren't able to really do a lot of growth during this time because I felt that all of my counselors were telling me that this was just the cost of doing business, and we probably would have been able to grow faster and hire more employees if I wasn't distracted by this. And frankly, it was strange to me because I felt like I was, you know, I'm an entrepreneur. I believe in the free market system. I believe that, you know, I was the master lemonade stand growing up as a kid on the corner of my house, and I felt like I was bringing a great product to the consumers. And at the end of the day, I was told that I was poisoning everybody, and that I felt a little bit violated in being accused of something that I really didn't have any idea of what was going on.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us, Chuck. We really appreciate it. David, turning back to you for a minute, let's drill down a little bit more into the study. What exactly does small business mean for our purposes, and how do they fare when compared to their larger counterparts?
It's a good question. I think that Chuck's story really highlights how litigation can be a major burden on businesses and small businesses in particular. Unfortunately, Chuck's experience is actually supported by the data. As I alluded to before, the cost of tort liability actually falls disproportionately onto small businesses. In our study, we find that small businesses, which we define to be those with less than $10 million in annual sales, those businesses account for 19% of business revenues. And while they account for 19% of revenue, they bear 53% of the cost of the commercial tort system. So that's more than 2.5 times their share of revenue. That is, small businesses really are bearing a disproportionately large share of the cost of the U.S. tort system. This pattern is even more pronounced for the smallest of the small businesses. Businesses with less than $1 million in annual revenue account for 7% of revenues and 39% of commercial liability costs. That's almost 5 times their share of revenue. There are a number of reasons that small companies can be expected to have higher costs. For one, large companies have access to a number of tools that small businesses do not. These are tools like more robust financial reserves, flexibility in choosing how to manage their risk, and the ability to naturally diversify across their operations. In addition, large businesses have superior bargaining power and can negotiate better rates on liability insurance. In contrast, small businesses tend to be price takers and will have higher costs as a result. The difference in the price of tort liability across businesses of different sizes is striking. While businesses with over $50 million in annual revenues have $4.40 of tort costs per $1,000 in annual revenues, small businesses have $22.90 of tort costs per $1,000 of revenue. This is even more pronounced for the smallest businesses with under $1 million in annual revenue. Those businesses can expect to incur $44.80 in tort liabilities per $1,000 of revenues they generate. In other words, the tort system is more than 10 times as expensive for the smallest businesses.
Great. Well, thanks for making us all a lot smarter, David. Okay, we're nearing the end of our time together today. So, Chuck, I'd like to direct this last question to you. If you could wave a magic wand and instantly make 1 or 2 changes to the lawsuit system to take some of this burden off of small business owners like you, what would you change?
Well, I just, thanks for asking. I actually, I wish that magic wand was here. I just signed a couple settlements last week for ADA lawsuits since COVID, because we didn't have 5% of our tables ADA accessible, our seating tables. And I just started another ADA lawsuit that occurred yesterday or earlier this week. And that was about not having a listening device for a comedy show that we let some Fuller Seminary students use our coffee house for. And I feel like, you know, at the very basic level, especially on the ADA front, if small businesses were given a week to try to find a solution to the problem, I would be saving a lot of money and a lot of sleepless nights, because the ADA lawsuits could be happening, since there's a 2-year statute of limitations, could be happening. So I don't even know how many ADA lawsuits might be filed right now against me. And I want to be in full compliance, but I just don't know all the laws. I mean, there's so many that we need to take care of. But unfortunately, ignorance isn't an excuse in court. So if I had a week to be able to fix some of the problems that we might have, that would be really helpful.
Thank you for that, Chuck, and best of luck to you with these ongoing issues. And thanks to both of you for sharing your perspective with us. For anyone in our audience who wants to learn more about the study and take a look at the numbers for yourself, you can find it in the research section at instituteforlegalreform.com. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of the program.